Chapter 8 of the Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 8 Whistler and Yap Yap, the Whistling or Hoary Marmot, and Prairie Dogs. Johnny Chuck was the first one on hand the next morning. The fact is, Johnny was quite excited over the discovery that he had some near relatives. He always had supposed that the Woodchucks were a family by themselves. Now that he knew that he had some close relatives, he was filled with quite as much curiosity as ever Peter Rabbit possessed. Just as soon as Old Mother Nature was ready to begin, Johnny Chuck was ready with the question. "If you please," said he, "who are my nearest relatives?" "The Marmots of the Far West," replied Old Mother Nature. "You know you are a Marmot, and these cousins of yours out there are a great deal like you in a general way. The biggest and handsomest of all is Whistler, who lives in the mountains of the Northwest. The fact is, he is the biggest of all the Marmot family." "Is he much bigger than Johnny Chuck?" asked Peter Rabbit. "Considerably bigger," replied Old Mother Nature, nodding her head. "Considerably bigger. I should think he would weigh twice as much as Johnny." Johnny's eyes opened very wide. "My!" he exclaimed. "I should like to see him. Does he look like me?" "In his shape he does," said Old Mother Nature, "but he has a very much handsomer coat. His coat is a mixture of dark brown and white hairs which give him a grayish color. The upper part of his head, his feet and nails are black, and so are his ears. A black band runs from behind each ear down to his neck. His chin is pure white, and there is white on his nose. Underneath he is a light rusty color. His fur is thicker and softer than yours, Johnny. This is because he lives where it is colder. His tail is larger, somewhat bushier, and is a blackish brown." "If you please, why is he called Whistler?" asked Johnny Chuck eagerly. "Because he has a sharp, clear whistle which can be heard a very long distance," replied Old Mother Nature. "He sits up just as you do. If he sees danger approaching he whistles, as a warning to all his relatives within hearing." "I suppose it is foolish to ask if he lives in a hole in the ground as Johnny Chuck does," spoke up Peter Rabbit. "He does," replied Old Mother Nature. "All Marmots live in holes in the ground. But Whistler lives in an entirely different country. He lives up on the sides of the mountains, often so high that no trees grow there, and the ground is rocky. He digs his hole down in between the rocks." "It must be a nice safe hole," said Peter. "I guess he doesn't have to worry about being dug out by Reddy Fox." "You guessed quite right," laughed Old Mother Nature. "Nevertheless, he has reason to fear being dug out. You see, out where he lives, Grizzly, the big cousin of Buster Bear, also lives, and Grizzly is very fond of a Marmot dinner when he can get one. He is so big and strong and has such great claws that he can pull the rocks apart and dig Whistler out. By the way, I forgot to tell you that Whistler is also called the Gray Marmot and the Hoary Marmot. He lives on grass and other green things, and, like Johnny Chuck, gets very fat in the fall and then sleeps all winter. There are one or two other Marmots in the Far West who live farther south than does Whistler, but their habits are much the same as those of Whistler and Johnny Chuck. None of them are social. I mean by that you never find two Marmot homes very close together. In this they differ from Johnny's smaller cousin, Yap Yap the Prairie Dog. Yap Yap wouldn't be happy if he didn't have close neighbors of his own kind. He has one of the most social natures of all my little people." "Tell us about him," begged Happy Jack Squirrel before Johnny Chuck, who is naturally slow, could ask for the same thing. "Yap Yap is the smallest of the Marmot family," said Old Mother Nature. "In a way he is about as closely related to the Ground Squirrels as he is to the Marmots. Johnny Chuck has only 4 claws on each front foot, but Yap Yap has 5, just as the Ground Squirrels have. He looks very much like a small Chuck, dressed in light yellow-brown. His tail for the most part is the same color as his coat, but the end is black, though there is one member of the family whose tail has a white tip. In each cheek is a small pouch, that is, a small pocket, and this is one of the things that shows how closely related to the spermophiles he is. As I said before, Yap Yap is very social by nature. He lives on the great open plains of the West and Southwest, frequently where it is very dry and rain seldom falls. When you find his home, you are sure to find the homes of many more Prairie Dogs very close at hand. Sometimes there are hundreds and hundreds of homes, making a regular town. This is because the Prairie Dogs dearly love the company of their own kind. "Does Yap Yap dig the same kind of hole that I do?" asked Johnny Chuck. "In a way it is like yours," replied Old Mother Nature, "but at the same time it is different. In the first place it goes almost straight down for a long distance. In the second place there is no mound of sand in front of Yap Yap's doorway. Instead of that, the doorway is right in the very middle of the mound of sand. One reason for this is that when it does rain out where Yap Yap lives, it rains very hard indeed, so that the water stands on the ground for a short time. The ground being flat, a lot of water would run down into Yap Yap's home and make him most uncomfortable if he did not do something to keep it out. So he brings the sand out and piles it all the way around his doorway and presses it down with his nose. In that way he builds up a firm mound which he uses for two purposes. One is to keep the water from running down the hole, and the other is a sort of watchtower. He sits at the top of his mound to watch for his enemies. His cousins with the white tail digs a hole more like yours. Yap Yap loves to visit his neighbors and to have them visit him. They are lively little people and do a great deal of talking among themselves. The instant one of them sees an enemy he gives a signal. Then every Prairie Dog scampers for his own hole and dives in head first. Almost at once he pops his head out again to see what the danger might be. "How can he do that without going clear to the bottom to turn around?" demanded Peter. "I wondered if any of you would think of that question," chuckled Old Mother Nature. "Just a little way down from the entrance Yap Yap digs a little room at one side of his tunnel. All he has to do is to scramble into that, turn around and then pop his head out. As I said before, his tunnel goes down very deep. Then it turns and goes almost equally far underground. Down there he has a nice little bedroom. Sometimes he has more than one." "If it is so dry out where he lives, how does he get water to drink?" asked Happy Jack. "He doesn't have to drink," replied Old Mother Nature. "Some folks think that he digs down until he finds water way down underneath, but this isn't so. He doesn't have to have water. He gets all the moisture he needs from the green things he eats." "I suppose like the rest of us he has lots of enemies?" said Peter. Old Mother Nature nodded. "Of course," said she. "Old Man Coyote and Reddy Fox are very fond of Prairie Dog. So are members of the Hawk family. Then in some places there is a cousin of Shadow the Weasel called the Black-footed Ferret. He is to be feared most of all because he can follow Yap Yap down into his hole. There is a cousin of Hooty the Owl called the Burrowing Owl because it builds its home in a hole in the ground. You are likely to find many burrowing owls living in Prairie Dog villages. Also you are apt to find Buzztail the Rattlesnake there. A lot of people believe that Yap Yap, Buzztail, and the little Burrowing Owl are the best of friends and often live together in the same hole. This isn't so at all. Buzztail is very fond of young Prairie Dog, and so is the Burrowing Owl. Rather than dig a hole for himself, the Owl will sometimes take possession of one of Yap Yap's deserted holes. If he should make a mistake and enter a hole in which Yap Yap was at home, the chances are that Yap Yap would kill the Owl, for he knows that the Owl is an enemy. Buzztail the Rattlesnake also makes use of Prairie Dog holes, but it is safe to say that if there are any Prairie Dog babies down there, they never live to see what the outside world is like. So Buzztail and the Burrowing Owl are really enemies instead of friends of Yap Yap the Prairie Dog. "Why is he called a dog?" asked Peter. Old Mother Nature laughed right out. "Goodness knows," said she. "He doesn't look like a dog and he doesn't act like a dog, so why people should call him a dog I don't know, unless it is because of his habit of barking, and even his bark isn't at all like a dog's, not nearly so much so as the bark of Reddy Fox. Now I guess this will do for today. Haven't you little folks had enough of school?" "No!" cried Peter Rabbit and Jumper the Hare and Happy Jack and Chatterer the Red Squirrel and Striped Chipmunk and Johnny Chuck. "We want to know about the rest of the members of the order of Rodents or Gnawers," added Peter. "Of course in a way they are sort of related to us, and we want to know about them." Old Mother Nature laughed good-naturedly. "All right," said she. "Come again tomorrow morning and we'll see what more we can learn." End of chapter 8.
Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 9. Two Queer Little Haymakers. The Pika, or Coney, and the Mountain Beaver, or Sewellel. There is nothing like a little knowledge to make one want more. Johnny Chuck, who had gone to school only because Old Mother Nature had sent for him, had become as full of curiosity as Peter Rabbit. The discovery that he had a big, handsome cousin, Whistler the Marmot, living in the mountains of the Far West had given Johnny something to think about. It seemed to Johnny such a queer place for a member of his family to live that he wanted to know more about it. So Johnny had a question all ready when Old Mother Nature called school to order the next morning. "If you please, Mother Nature," said he, "does my cousin Whistler have any neighbors up among those rocks where he lives?" "He certainly does," replied Old Mother Nature, nodding her head. "He has for a near neighbor one of the quaintest and most interesting little members of the big order to which you all belong." "And that order is what?" she asked abruptly. "The order of Rodents," replied Peter Rabbit promptly. "Right, Peter," replied Old Mother Nature, smiling at Peter. "I asked that just to see if you really are learning. I wanted to make sure that I am not wasting my time with you little folks. Now, this little neighbor of Whistler is Little Chief Hare." Instantly Peter Rabbit and Jumper the Hare pricked up their long ears and became more interested than ever, if that were possible. "I thought you had told us all about our family," cried Jumper, "but you didn't mention Little Chief." "No," said Old Mother Nature, "I didn't, and the reason I didn't was because Little Chief isn't a member of your family. He is called Little Chief Hare, but he isn't a hare at all, although he looks much like a small rabbit with short hind legs and rounded ears. He has a family all to himself and should be called a Pika. Some folks do call him that, but more call him a Coney, and some call him the Crying Hare. This is because he uses his voice a great deal, which is something no member of the Hare family does. In size he is just about as big as one of your half-grown babies, Peter, so, you see, he really is a little fellow. His coat is grayish-brown. His ears are of a good size, but instead of being long are round. He has small bright eyes. His legs are short, his hind legs being very little longer than his front ones. He has hair on the soles of his feet, just like the members of the Hare family." "What about his tail?" piped up Peter Rabbit. You know Peter is very much interested in tails. Old Mother Nature smiled. "He is worse off than you, Peter," said she, "for he hasn't any at all. That is, he hasn't any that can be seen. He lives way up among the rocks of the great mountains above where the trees grow, and often is a very near neighbor to Whistler." "I suppose that means that he makes his home down in under rocks, the same as Whistler does," spoke up Johnny Chuck. "Right," replied Old Mother Nature. "He is such a little fellow that he can get through very narrow places, and he has his home and barns way down in among the rocks." "Barns!" exclaimed Happy Jack Squirrel. "Barns! What do you mean by barns?" Old Mother Nature laughed. "I just call them barns," said she, "because they are places where he stores away his hay, just as Farmer Brown stores away his hay in his barn. I suppose you would call them storehouses." At the mention of hay, Peter Rabbit sat bolt upright, and his eyes were wide open with astonishment. "Did you say hay?" he exclaimed. "Where under the sun does he get hay way up there, and what does he want of it?" There was a twinkle in Old Mother Nature's eyes as she replied. He makes that hay just as you see Farmer Brown make hay every summer. It is what he lives on in the winter and in bad weather. Little Chief knows just as much about the proper way of making hay as Farmer Brown does. Even way up among the rocks there are places where grass and pea vines and other green things grow. Little Chief lives on these in summer, but he is as wise and thrifty as any Squirrel, another way in which he differs from the Hare family. He cuts them when they are ready for cutting and spreads them out on the rocks to dry in the sun. He knows that if he should take them down into his barns while they are fresh and green, they would sour and spoil, so he never stores them away until they are thoroughly dry. Then, of course, they are hay, for hay is nothing but sun-dried grass cut before it has begun to die. When his hay is just as dry as it should be, he takes it down and stores it away in his barns, which are nothing but little caves down in among the rocks. There he has it for use in winter, when there is no green food. Little Chief is so nearly the color of the rocks that it takes sharp eyes to see him when he is sitting still. He has a funny little squeaking voice, and he uses it a great deal. It is a funny voice because it is hard to tell just where it comes from. It seems to come from nowhere in particular. Sometimes he can be heard squeaking way down in his home under the rocks. Like Johnny Chuck, he prefers to sleep at night and be abroad during the day. Because he is so small, he must always be on the lookout for enemies. At the first hint of danger he scampers to safety in among the rocks, and there he scolds whoever has frightened him. There is no more lovable little person in all my great family than this little haymaker of the mountains of the Great West. "That haymaking is a pretty good idea of Little Chief's," remarked Peter Rabbit, scratching a long ear with a long hind foot. "I've a great mind to try it myself." Everybody laughed right out, for everybody knew just how easy-going and thriftless Peter was. Peter himself grinned. He couldn't help it. "That would be a very good idea, Peter," said Old Mother Nature. "By the way, there is another haymaker out there in those same great mountains of the Far West." "Who?" demanded Peter and Johnny Chuck and Happy Squirrel, all in the same breath. "Stubtail the Mountain Beaver," declared Peter promptly. "I suppose Stubtail is his cousin." Old Mother Nature shook her head. "No," said she. "No, Stubtail and Paddy are no more closely related than the rest of you. Stubtail isn't a Beaver at all. His proper name is Sewellel. Sometimes he is called Shotel, and sometimes the Boomer, and sometimes the Chehalis, but most folks call him the Mountain Beaver." "Is it because he looks like Paddy the Beaver?" Striped Chipmunk asked. "No," replied Mother Nature. "He looks more like Jerry Muskrat than he does like Paddy. He is about Jerry's size and looks very much as Jerry would if he had no tail." "Hasn't he any tail at all?" Peter asked. "Yes, he has a little tail, a little stub of a tail, but it is so small that to look at him you would think he hadn't any," replied Old Mother Nature. "He is found out in the same mountains of the Far West where Whistler and Little Chief live, but instead of living way up high among the rocks, he is at home down in the valleys where the ground is soft and the trees grow thickly. Stubtail has no use for rocks. He wants soft, wet ground where he can tunnel and tunnel to his heart's content. In one thing Stubtail is very like Yap Yap the Prairie Dog." "Who is that?" asked Johnny Chuck quickly, for you know Yap Yap is Johnny's cousin. "In his social habits," replied Old Mother Nature, "Stubtail isn't fond of living alone. He wants company of his own kind. So wherever you find Stubtail, you are likely to find many of his family. They like to go visiting back and forth. They make little paths between their homes and all about through the thick ferns, and they keep these little patches free and clear so that they may run along them easily. Some of these little paths lead into long tunnels. These are made for safety. Usually the ground is so wet that there will be water running in the bottoms of these little tunnels." "What kind of a house does Stubtail have?" inquired Johnny Chuck interestedly. "A hole in the ground, of course," replied Old Mother Nature. "It is dug where the ground is drier than where the runways are made. Mrs. Stubtail makes a nest of dried ferns, and close by they build 2 or 3 storehouses, for Stubtail and Mrs. Stubtail are thrifty people. "I suppose he fills them with hay, for you said he is a haymaker," remarked Happy Jack Squirrel, who was always interested in storehouses. "Yes," replied Old Mother Nature. "He puts hay in them. He cuts grasses, ferns, pea vines, and other green plants and carries them in little bundles to the entrance of his tunnel. There he piles them on sticks so as to keep them off the damp ground, and so that the air can help dry them out. When they are dry, he takes them inside and stores them away. He also stores other things. He likes the roots of ferns. He cuts tender young twigs from bushes and stores away some of these. He is fond of bark. In winter he is quite as active as in summer and tunnels about under the snow. Then he sometimes has Peter Rabbit's bad habit of killing trees by gnawing bark all around as high up as he can reach." "Can he climb trees?" asked Chatterer the Red Squirrel. "Just about as much as Johnny Chuck can," replied Old Mother Nature. "Sometimes he climbs up in low bushes or in small, low-branching trees to cut off tender shoots, but he doesn't do much of this sort of thing. His home is on the ground. He is most active at night, but where undisturbed is out more or less during the day. When he wants to cut off a twig, he sits up like a squirrel and holds the twig in his hands while he bites it off with his sharp teeth." "You didn't tell us what color his coat is," said Peter Rabbit. "I told you he looked very much like Jerry Muskrat," replied Old Mother Nature. "His coat is brown, much the color of Jerry's, but his fur is not nearly so soft and fine." "I suppose he has enemies, just as the rest of us little people have," said Peter. "Of course," replied Old Mother Nature. "All little people have enemies, and most big ones too, for that matter. King Eagle is one and Yowler the Bobcat is another. They are always watching for Stubtail. That is why he digs so many tunnels. He can travel under the ground then. My goodness, how time flies! Scamper home, all of you, for I have too much to do to talk any more today." End of chapter 9.
The Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 10. Prickly Porky and Grubby Gopher. Introducing the Porcupine and the Pocket Gopher. All the way to school the next morning, Peter Rabbit wondered who they would learn about that day. He was so busy wondering that he was heedless. Peter is apt to be heedless at times. The result was that as he hopped out of a bramble tangle just within the edge of the Green Forest, he all but landed in something worse than the worst brambles that ever grew. It was only by a wild side jump that he saved himself. Peter had almost landed among the 1,000 little spears of Prickly Porky the Porcupine. "Gracious!" exclaimed Peter. "Why don't you look where you are going?" grunted Prickly Porky. Plainly he was rather peevish. "It wouldn't be my fault if you had a few of my little spears sticking in you this very minute, and it would serve you right." He waddled along a few steps, then began talking again. "I don't see why Old Mother Nature sent for me this morning," he grumbled. "I hate a long walk." Peter pricked up his long ears. "I know!" he cried. "You're going to school, Prickly Porky. You're a rodent, and we are going to learn all about you this morning." "I'm not a rodent, I'm a porcupine," grunted Prickly Porky indignantly. "You're a rodent just the same. You've got big gnawing teeth, and anyone with that kind of teeth is a rodent," retorted Peter. Then at a sudden thought a funny look passed over his face. "Why, that means that you and I are related in a way," he added. "Don't believe it," muttered Prickly Porky, still shuffling along. "Don't believe it. Don't want to be related to anybody as heedless as you. What is this school, anyway? Don't want to go to school. Know all I want to know. Know how to get all I want to eat, how to make everybody get out of my way and leave me alone, and that's enough to know." He rattled the 1,000 little spears hidden in his coat, and Peter shivered at the sound. It was a most unpleasant sound. "Well, some folks do like to be stupid," snapped Peter, and hurried on lipperty-lipperty-lip, while Prickly Porky slowly shuffled and rattled along behind. All the others were there when Peter arrived. Prickly Porky wasn't even in sight. Old Mother Nature wasted no time. She has too much to do ever to waste time. She called the school to order at once. "Yesterday," she began, "I told you about two little haymakers of the high mountains of the Far West. Who were they, Peter Rabbit?" "Little Chief Hare, called the Pika or Coney, and Stubtail the Mountain Beaver or Sewellel," replied Peter with great promptness. "Right," said Old Mother Nature. "Now I am going to tell you of one of my little plowmen who also lives in the Far West, but prefers the great plains to the high mountains, though he is sometimes found in the latter. He is Grubby the Gopher, a member of the same order the rest of you belong to, but of a family quite his own. He is properly called the Pocket Gopher, and way down in the southeast, where he is also found, he is called a salamander, though what for I haven't the slightest idea." "Does he have pockets in his cheeks like mine?" asked Striped Chipmunk eagerly. "He has pockets in his cheeks, and that is why he is called Pocket Gopher," replied Old Mother Nature. "But they are not at all like yours, Striped Chipmunk. Yours are on the inside of your cheeks, but his are on the outside." "How funny!" exclaimed Striped Chipmunk. "Your pockets are small compared with those of Grubby," continued Old Mother Nature. "One of his covers almost the whole side of his head back to his short neck, and it is lined with fur, and remember he has two of them. Grubby uses these for carrying food, and never for carrying out earth when he is digging a tunnel, as some folks think he does. He stuffs them full with his front feet and empties them by pressing them from the back with his feet. The Gopher family is quite large, and the members range in size from the size of Danny Meadow Mouse to that of Robber the Rat, only these bigger members are stouter and heavier than Robber. Some are reddish-brown and some are gray. But whatever his size and wherever he is found, Grubby's habits are the same." All this time Peter Rabbit had been fidgeting about. It was quite clear that Peter had something on his mind. Now, as Old Mother Nature paused, Peter found the chance he had been waiting for. "If you please, why did you call him a plowman?" he asked eagerly. "I'm coming to that all in due time," replied Old Mother Nature, smiling at Peter's eagerness. "Grubby Gopher spends most of his life underground, very much like Miner the Mole, whom you all know. He can dig tunnels just about as fast. His legs are short, and his front legs and feet are very stout and strong. They are armed with very long, strong claws, and it is with these and the help of his big cutting teeth that Grubby digs. He throws the earth under him and then kicks it behind him with his hind feet. When he has quite a pile behind him, he turns around, and with his front feet and head pushes it along to a little side tunnel and then up to the surface of the ground. As soon as he has it all out, he plugs up the opening and goes back to digging. The loose earth he has pushed out makes little mounds, and he makes one of these little mounds every few feet. Grubby is a great worker. He is very industrious. Since he is underground, it doesn't make much difference to him whether it be night or day. In summer, during the hottest part of the day, he rests. His eyes are small and weak because he has little use for them, coming out on the surface very seldom, and then usually in the dusk. He has a funny little tail without any hair on it. This is very sensitive and serves him as a sort of guide when he runs backward along his tunnel, which he can do quite fast. A funny thing about those long claws on his front feet is that he folds them under when he is walking or running. Do any of you know why Farmer Brown plows his garden? As she asked this, Old Mother Nature looked from one to another, and each in turn shook his head. It is to mix the dead vegetable matter thoroughly with the earth, so that the roots of the plants may get it easily, explained Old Mother Nature. By making those tunnels in every direction and bringing up the earth below to the surface, Grubby Gopher does the same thing. That is why I call him my little plowman. He loosens up the hard, packed earth and mixes the vegetable matter with it, and so makes it easy for seeds to sprout and plants to grow. "Then he must be one of the farmer's best friends," spoke up Happy Jack Squirrel. Old Mother Nature shook her head. "He has been in the past," said she. He has done a wonderful work in helping make the land fit for farming. But where land is being farmed, he is a dreadful pest, I am sorry to say. You see, he eats the crops the farmer tries to raise, and the new mounds he is all the time throwing up bury a lot of the young plants, and in the meadows make it very hard to use a mowing machine for cutting hay. Then Grubby gets into young orchards and cuts off all the tender roots of young trees. This kills them. You see, he is fond of tender roots, seeds, stems of grass and grain, and is never happier than when he can find a field of potatoes. Being such a worker, he has to have a great deal to eat. Then, too, he stores away a great deal for winter, for he doesn't sleep in winter as Johnny Chuck does. He even tunnels about under the snow. Sometimes he fills these little snow tunnels with the earth he brings up from below, and when the snow melts, it leaves queer little earth ridges to show where the tunnels were. Grubby is very neat in his habits, and keeps his home and himself very clean. During the day he leaves one of his mounds open for a little while to let in fresh air, but it is only for a little while. Then he closes it again. He doesn't dare leave it open very long, for fear Shadow the Weasel or a certain big snake called the gopher snake will find it and come in after him. Digger the Badger is the only one of his enemies who can dig fast enough to dig him out, but at night, when he likes to come out for a little air or to cut grain and grass, he must always watch for Hooty the Owl. Old Man Coyote and members of the Hawk family are always looking for him by day, so you see, he has plenty of enemies like the rest of you. He got the name Gopher because that comes from a word meaning honeycomb, and Grubby's tunnels go in every direction until the ground is like a honeycomb. He isn't a bit social and has rather a mean disposition. He is always ready to fight. On the plains he has done a great deal to make the soil fine and rich, as I have already told you, but on hillsides he does a great deal of harm. The water runs down his tunnels and washes away the soil. Because of this, and the damage he does to crops, man is his greatest enemy. But man has furnished him with new and splendid foods easy to get, and so Grubby's family increases faster than it used to, in spite of traps and poison. Hello! See who's here! It is about time. There was a shuffling and rattling and grunting, and Prickly Porky slowly climbed up on an old stump, looking very peevish and much out of sorts. He had come to school much against his will. End of Chapter 10. Of the Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 11. A Fellow with 1,000 Spears. More about the porcupine. There, said Old Mother Nature, pointing to Prickly Porky the porcupine, is next to the largest member of your order, which is Order of Rodents, piped up Striped Chipmunk. He is not only next to the largest, but is the stupidest, continued Old Mother Nature. At least that is what people say of him, though I suspect he isn't as stupid as he sometimes seems. Anyway, he manages to keep well fed and escape his enemies, which is more than can be said for some others who are supposed to have quick wits. Escaping his enemies is no credit to him. They are only too glad to keep out of his way. He doesn't have to fear anybody, said Chatterer the Squirrel to his cousin, Happy Jack. His remark didn't escape the keen ears of Old Mother Nature. Are you sure about that? She demanded. Now there's Pekan the Fisher. She was interrupted by a great rattling on the old stump. Everybody turned to look. There was Prickly Porky backing down as fast as he could, which wasn't fast at all, and rattling his 1,000 little spears as he did so. It was really very funny. Everybody had to laugh, even Old Mother Nature. You see, it was plain that he was in a great hurry, yet every movement was slow and clumsy. Well, Prickly Porky, what does this mean? Where are you going? Demanded Old Mother Nature. Prickly Porky turned his dull-looking eyes toward her, and in them was a troubled, worried look. Where's Pekan the Fisher? He said, and his voice shook a little, with something very much like fear. Old Mother Nature understood instantly. When she had said, Now there's Pekan the Fisher, Prickly Porky had waited to hear no more. He had instantly thought that she meant that Pekan was right there somewhere. "It's all right, Prickly Porky," said she. "Pekan isn't anywhere around here, so climb back up on that stump and don't worry. Had you waited for me to finish, you would have saved yourself a fright. Chatterer had just said that you didn't have to fear anybody, and I was starting to explain that he was wrong, that despite your 1,000 little spears, you have reason to fear Pekan the Fisher." Prickly Porky shivered, and this made the 1,000 little spears in his coat rattle. It was such a surprising thing to see Prickly Porky actually afraid, that the other little folks almost doubted their own eyes. "Are you quite sure that Pekan isn't anywhere around?" asked Prickly Porky, and his voice still shook. "Quite sure," replied Old Mother Nature. "If he were, I wouldn't allow him to hurt you. You ought to know that. Now sit up so that every one can get a good look at you." Prickly Porky sat up, and the others gathered around the foot of the stump to look at him. "He certainly is no beauty," murmured Happy Jack the Squirrel. Happy Jack was quite right. He was anything but handsome. The truth is, he was the homeliest, clumsiest looking fellow in all the Green Forest. He was a little bigger than Bobby Coon, and his body was thick and heavy looking. His back humped up like an arch. His head was rather small for the size of his body, short and rather round. His neck was even shorter. His eyes were small and very dull. It was plain that he couldn't see far or clearly unless what he was looking at was close at hand. His ears were small and nearly hidden in hair. His front teeth, the gnawing teeth which showed him to be a rodent, were very large and bright orange. His legs were short and stout. He had 4 toes on each front foot and 5 on each hind foot, and these were armed with quite long, stout claws. But the queerest thing and the most interesting thing about Prickly Porky was his coat. Not one among the other little people of the Green Forest has a coat anything like his. Most of them have a short, soft underfur protected and more or less hidden by longer, coarse hair. Prickly Porky had the long, coarse hair, and on his back it was very long and coarse, brownish-black in color up to the tips, which were white. Under this long hair was some soft woolly fur, but what that long hair hid chiefly was an array of wicked-looking little spears called quills. They were white to the tips, which were very dark and very, very sharply pointed. All down the sides were little barbs, so small as hardly to be seen, but there just the same. On his head the quills were about an inch long, but on his back they were 4 inches long, becoming shorter towards the tail. The latter was rather short, stout, and covered with short quills. As he sat there on that old stump, some of Prickly Porky's little spears could be seen peeping out from the long hair on his back, but they didn't look particularly dangerous. Peter Rabbit suddenly made a discovery. "Why," he exclaimed, "he hasn't any little spears on the underside of him!" "I wondered who would be the first to notice that," said Old Mother Nature. "No, Prickly Porky hasn't any little spears underneath, and Pekan the Fisher has found that out. He knows that if he can turn Prickly Porky on his back, he can kill him without much danger from those little spears, and he has learned how to do that very thing. That is why Prickly Porky is afraid of him. Now, Prickly Porky, climb down off that stump and show these little folks what you do when an enemy comes near." Grumbling and growling, Prickly Porky climbed down to the ground. Then he tucked his head down between his front paws, and suddenly the 1,000 little spears appeared all over him, pointing in every direction until he looked like a giant chestnut burr. Then he began to thrash his tail from side to side. "What's he doing that for?" asked Johnny Chuck, looking rather puzzled. "Go near enough to be hit by it, and you'll understand," said Old Mother Nature dryly. "That is his one weapon. Whoever is hit by that tail will find himself full of those little spears and will take care never to go near Prickly Porky again. Once those little spears have entered the skin, they keep working in deeper and deeper, and more than one of his enemies has been killed by them. On account of those tiny barbs, they are hard to pull out, and pulling them out hurts dreadfully. Just try one and see." But no one was anxious to try, so Old Mother Nature paused only a moment. "You will notice that he moves that tail quickly," she continued. "It is the only thing about him which is quick. When he has a chance, in time of danger, he likes to get his head under a log or rock instead of putting it between his paws, as he is doing now. Then he plants his feet firmly and waits for a chance to use that tail." Is it true that he can throw those little spears at folks?" asked Peter. Old Mother Nature shook her head. "There isn't a word of truth in it," she declared. "That story probably was started by some one who was hit by his tail, and it was done so quickly that the victim didn't see the tail move and so thought the little spears were thrown at him." "How does he make all those little spears stand up that way?" asked Jumper the Hare. "He has a special set of muscles for just that purpose," explained Old Mother Nature. "When those quills stick into some one, they must pull out of Prickly Porky's own skin. I should think that would hurt him," spoke up Striped Chipmunk. "Not at all," replied Old Mother Nature. "They are very loosely fastened in his skin and come out at the least little pull. New ones grow to take the place of those he loses. Notice that he puts his whole foot flat on the ground just as Buster Bear and Bobby Coon do, and just as those two-legged creatures called men do. Very few animals do this, and those that do are said to be plantigrade. Now, Prickly Porky, tell us what you eat and where you make your home, and that will end today's lesson." "I eat bark, twigs, and leaves mostly," grunted Prickly Porky ungraciously. "I like hemlock best of all, but also eat poplar, pine, and other trees for a change. Sometimes I stay in a tree for days until I have stripped it of all its bark and leaves. I don't see any sense in moving about any more than it's necessary." "But that must kill the tree!" exclaimed Peter Rabbit. "Well, what of it?" demanded Prickly Porky crossly. "There are plenty of trees. In summer I like lily pads and always get them when I can." "Can you swim?" asked Peter eagerly. "Of course," grunted Prickly Porky. "I never see you out on the Green Meadows," said Peter. "And you never will," retorted Prickly Porky. "The Green Forest for me every time, summer or winter I'm at home there." "Don't you sleep through the cold weather the way Buster Bear and I do?" asked Johnny Chuck. "What should I sleep for?" grumbled Prickly Porky. "Cold weather doesn't bother me. I like it. I have the Green Forest pretty much to myself then. I like to be alone. And as long as there are trees, there's plenty to eat. I sleep a great deal in the daytime because I like night best." "What about your home?" asked Happy Jack. "Home is wherever I happen to be most of the time. But Mrs. Porky has a home in a hollow log or a cave or under the roots of a tree where the babies are born. I guess that's all I have to tell you." "You might add that those babies are big for the size of their mother and have a full supply of quills when they are born," said Old Mother Nature. "And you forgot to say how fond of salt you are, and how often this fondness gets you into trouble around the camps of men. Your fear of Pekan the Fisher we all saw. I might add that Puma the Panther is to be feared at times, and when he is very hungry Buster Bear will take a chance on turning you on your back. By the way, don't any of you call Prickly Porky a hedgehog. He isn't anything of the kind. He is sometimes called a quill pig, but his real name, Porcupine, is best. He has no near relatives. Tomorrow morning, instead of meeting here, we'll hold school on the shore of the pond Paddy the Beaver has made. School is dismissed. End of Chapter 11.
Of the Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 12. A Lumberman and Engineer. The Beaver and His Works. Johnny Chuck and Striped Chipmunk were the only ones who were not on hand at the pond of Paddy the Beaver deep in the Green Forest at sunup the next morning. Johnny and Striped Chipmunk were afraid to go so far from home. To the surprise of everybody, Prickly Porky was there. "He must have traveled all night to get here, he is such a slowpoke," said Peter Rabbit to his cousin, Jumper the Hare. Peter wasn't far from the truth, but however he got there, there he was, reaching for lily pads from an old log which lay half in the water, and appearing very well satisfied with life. You know, there is nothing like a good meal of things you like to make everything seem just as it should. Old Mother Nature seated herself on one end of Paddy's dam and called the school to order. Just as she did so a brown head popped out of the water close by, and a pair of anxious eyes looked up at Old Mother Nature. "It is quite all right, Paddy," she said softly. These little folks are trying to gain a little knowledge of themselves and other folks, and we are going to have this morning's lesson right here because it is to be about you." Paddy the Beaver no longer looked anxious. There was a sparkle in his eyes. "May I stay?" he asked eagerly. "If there's a chance to learn anything, I don't want to miss it." Before Old Mother Nature could reply, Peter Rabbit spoke up. "But the lesson is to be about you and your family. Do you expect to learn anything about yourself?" he demanded, and chuckled as if he thought that was a great joke. "It seems to me that some one named Peter learned a great deal about his own family when he first came to school to me," said Old Mother Nature. Peter had grace enough to hang his head and look ashamed. "Of course you may stay, Paddy. In fact, I want you to. There are some things I shall want you to explain. That is why we are holding school over here this morning. Just come up here on your dam where we can all get a good look at you." Paddy the Beaver climbed out on his dam. It was the first time Happy Jack Squirrel ever had seen him out of the water, and Happy Jack gave a little gasp of surprise. "I had no idea he is so big!" he exclaimed. "He is the biggest of all the rodents in this country, and one of the biggest in all the Great World. Also, he is the smartest member of the whole order," said Old Mother Nature. "He doesn't look it," said Chatterer the Squirrel with a saucy jerk of his tail. "Which means, I suppose, that you wouldn't have the least doubt that you are quite as smart as he," said Old Mother Nature quietly, and Chatterer looked both guilty and a little bit ashamed. "I'll admit that you are smart, Chatterer, but often it is in a wrong way. Paddy is smart in the very best way. He is a lumberman, builder and engineer. A lot of my little people are workers, but they are destructive workers. The busier they are, the more they destroy. Paddy the Beaver is a constructive worker. That means he is a builder instead of a destroyer." "How about all those trees he cuts down? If that isn't destroying, I don't know what is," said Chatterer, and with each word jerked his tail as if somehow his tongue and tail were connected. "So it is," replied Old Mother Nature good-naturedly. "But just think of the number of trees you destroy." "I never have destroyed a tree in my life," declared Chatterer indignantly. "Yes, you have," retorted Old Mother Nature. "I never have," contradicted Chatterer, quite forgetting to whom he was speaking. But Old Mother Nature overlooked this. "I don't suppose you ever ate a chestnut or a fat hickory nut or a sweet beech nut?" said she softly. "Of course," retorted Chatterer sharply. "I've eaten ever and ever and ever so many of them. What of it?" "In the heart of each one was a little tree," explained Old Mother Nature. "But for you very many of those little trees would have sprung up and some day would have been made big trees. So you see for every tree Paddy has destroyed, you probably have destroyed 100. You eat the nuts that you may live. Paddy cuts down the trees that he may live, for the bark of those trees is his food. Like Prickly Porky, he lives chiefly on bark. But unlike Prickly Porky, he doesn't destroy a tree for the bark alone. He wastes nothing. He makes use of every bit of that tree. He does something for the Green Forest in return for the trees he takes." Chatterer looked at Happy Jack and blinked in a puzzled way. Happy Jack looked at Peter Rabbit and blinked. Peter looked at Jumper the Hare and blinked. Jumper looked at Prickly Porky and blinked. Then all looked at Paddy the Beaver and finally at Old Mother Nature, and all blinked. Old Mother Nature chuckled. "Don't you think the Green Forest is more beautiful because of this little pond?" she asked. Everybody nodded. "Of course," she continued, "but there wouldn't be any little pond here were it not for Paddy and the trees he has cut. He destroyed the trees in order to make the pond. That is what I meant when I called him a constructive worker. Now I want you all to take a good look at Paddy. Then he will show us just how as a lumberman he cuts trees, as a builder he constructs houses and dams, and as an engineer he digs canals." As Paddy sat there on his dam, he looked rather like a giant member of the Rat family, though his head was more like that of a Squirrel than a Rat. His body was very thick and heavy, and in color he was dark brown, lighter underneath than above. Squatting there on the dam his back was rounded. Altogether he was a very clumsy-looking fellow. Peter Rabbit appeared to be interested in just one thing, Paddy's tail. He couldn't keep his eyes off it. Old Mother Nature noticed this. "Well, Peter," said she, "what have you on your mind now?" "That tail," replied Peter. "That's the queerest tail I've ever seen. I should think it would be very heavy and dreadfully in the way." Old Mother Nature laughed. "If you ask him, Paddy will tell you that that tail is the handiest tail in the Green Forest," said she. "There isn't another like it in all the Great World, and if you'll be patient you will see just how handy it is." It was a queer looking tail. It was broad and thick and flat, oval in shape, and covered with scales instead of hair. Just then Jumper the Hare made a discovery. "Why," he exclaimed, "Paddy has feet like Honker the Goose." "Only my hind feet," said Paddy. "They have webs between the toes just as Honker's have. That is for swimming. But there are no webs between my fingers." He held up a hand for all to see. Sure enough, the fingers were free. "Now that everybody has had a good look at you, Paddy," said Old Mother Nature, "suppose you swim over to where you have been cutting trees. We will join you there, and then you can show us just how you work." Paddy slipped into the water, where for a second or two he floated with just his head above the surface. Then he quickly raised his broad, heavy tail and brought it down on the water with a slap that sounded like the crack of a terrible gun. It was so loud and unexpected that every one save Old Mother Nature and Prickly Porky jumped with fright. Peter Rabbit happened to be right on the edge of the dam, and because he jumped before he had time to think, he jumped right into the water with a splash. Now Peter doesn't like the water, as you know, and he scrambled out just as fast as ever he could. How the others did laugh at him! "What did he do that for?" demanded Peter indignantly. "To show you one use he has for that handy tail," replied Old Mother Nature. "That is the way he gives warning to his friends whenever he discovers danger. Did you notice how he used his tail to aid him in swimming? He turns it almost on edge and uses it as a rudder. Those big webbed hind feet are the paddles which drive him through the water. He can stay under water a long time, as much as 5 minutes. See, he has just come up now." Sure enough, Paddy's head had just appeared clear across the pond, almost to the opposite shore, and he was now swimming on the surface. Old Mother Nature at once led the way around the pond to a small grove of poplar trees which stood a little way back from the water. Paddy was already there. "Now," said Old Mother Nature, "show us what kind of lumberman you are." Paddy picked out a small tree, sat up much as Happy Jack Squirrel does, but with his big flat tail on the ground to brace him, seized the trunk of the tree in both hands, and went to work with his great orange-colored cutting teeth. He bit out a big chip, then another and another. Gradually he worked around the tree. After a while the tree began to sway and crack. Paddy bit out 2 or 3 more chips, then suddenly slapped the ground with his tail as a warning and scampered back to a safe distance. He was taking no chances of being caught under that falling tree. The tree fell, and at once Paddy returned to work. The smaller branches he cut off with a single bite at the base of each. The larger ones required a number of bites. Then he set to work to cut the trunk up in short logs. At this point Old Mother Nature interrupted. "Now show us," said she, "what you do with the logs." Paddy at once got behind a log and by pushing rolled it ahead of him until at last it fell with a splash in the water of a ditch or canal which led from near that grove of trees to the pond. Paddy followed into the water and began to push it ahead of him towards the pond. "That'll do," spoke up Old Mother Nature. "Come out and show us how you take the branches." Obediently Paddy climbed out and returned to the fallen tree. There he picked up one of the long branches in his mouth, grasping it near the butt, twisted it over his shoulder, and started to drag it to the canal. When he reached the latter, he entered the water and began swimming, still dragging the branch in the same way. Once more Old Mother Nature stopped him. "You've shown us how you cut trees and move them, so now I want you to answer a few questions," said she. Paddy climbed out and squatted on the bank. "How did this canal happen to be here handy?" asked Old Mother Nature. "Why, I dug it, of course," replied Paddy, looking surprised. "You see, I'm rather slow and clumsy on land, and don't like to be far from water. Those trees are pretty well back from the pond, so I dug this canal which brings the water almost to them. It makes it safer for me in case Old Man Coyote or Buster Bear or Yowler the Bobcat happens to be looking for a Beaver dinner. Also it makes it very much easier to get my logs and branches to the pond." Old Mother Nature nodded. "Just so," said she. "I want the rest of you to notice how well this canal has been dug. At the other end it is carried along the bottom of the pond where the water is shallow, so as to give greater depth. Now you will understand why I called Paddy an engineer. What do you do with your logs and branches, Paddy?" "Put them in my food pile, out there where the water is deep near my house," replied Paddy promptly. "The bark I eat, and the bare sticks I use to keep my house and dam in repair. In the late fall I cut enough trees to keep me in food all winter. When my pond is covered with ice I have nothing to worry about. My food supply is below the ice. When I am hungry I swim out under the ice, get a stick, take it back into my house, and eat the bark. Then I take the bare stick outside to use when needed on my dam or house." "How did you come to make this fine pond?" asked Old Mother Nature. "Oh, I just happened to come exploring up the Laughing Brook and found there was plenty of food here and a good place for a pond," replied Paddy. "I thought I would like to live here. Down where my dam is, the Laughing Brook was shallow, just the place for a dam." "Tell us why you wanted a pond and how you built that dam," commanded Old Mother Nature. "Why, I had to have a pond if I was to stay here," replied Paddy, as if everyone must understand that. "The Laughing Brook wasn't deep or big enough for me to live here safely. If it had been, I would have made my home in the bank and not bothered with the house or dam. But it wasn't, so I had to make a pond. It required a lot of hard work, but it is worth all it cost. First I cut a lot of brush and young trees and placed them in the Laughing Brook in that shallow place with the butts pointing upstream. I kept them in place by piling mud and stones on them. Then I kept piling on more sticks and brush and mud. The water brought down leaves and floating stuff, and this caught in the dam and helped fill it in. I dug a lot of mud in front of it and used this to fill in the spaces between the sticks. This made the water deeper in front of the dam and at the same time kept it from getting through. As the water backed up, of course it made a pond. I kept making my dam longer and higher, and the longer and higher it became, the bigger the pond grew. When it was big enough and deep enough to suit me, I stopped work on the dam and built my house out there." Everybody turned to look at Paddy's house, the roof of which stood high out of water a little way from the dam. "Tell us how you built that," said Old Mother Nature quietly. "Oh, I just made a big platform of sticks and mud out there where it was deep enough for me to be sure that the water could not freeze clear to the bottom, even in the coldest weather," replied Paddy in a matter-of-fact tone. "I built it up until it was above water. Then I built the walls and roof of sticks and mud, just as you see them there. Inside I have a fine big room with a comfortable bed of shredded wood. I have 2 openings in the floor with a long passage leading from each down through the foundations and opening at the bottom of the pond. Of course these are filled with water. Some houses have only 1 passage, but I like 2. These are the only entrances to my house. Every fall I repair my walls and roof, adding sticks and mud and turf so that now they are very thick. Late in the fall I sometimes plaster the outside with mud. This freezes hard, and no enemy who may reach my house on the ice can tear it open. I guess that's all." Peter Rabbit drew a long breath. "What dreadful lot of work," said he. "Do you work all the time?" Paddy chuckled. "No, Peter," said he, and Old Mother Nature nodded in approval. "Quite right," said she. "Quite right. Are there any more questions?" "Do you eat nothing but bark?" It was Happy Jack Squirrel who spoke. "Oh, no," replied Paddy. "In summer I eat berries, mushrooms, grass, and the leaves and stems of a number of plants. In winter I vary my fare with lily roots and the roots of alder and willow. But bark is my principal food." Old Mother Nature waited a few minutes, but as there were no more questions she added a few words. "Now I hope you understand why I am so proud of Paddy the Beaver, and why I told you that he is a lumberman, builder and engineer," said she. "For the next lesson we will take up the Rat family." End of chapter 12.
13 of the Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Anne Walden. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 13. A Worker and a Robber. The Muskrat and the Brown or Norway Rat. Now we come to the largest family of the rodent order, the Rat family, which of course includes the mice, said Old Mother Nature, after calling school to order at the old meeting place. And the largest member of the family reminds me very much of the one we learned about yesterday. "I know," cried Peter Rabbit. "You mean Jerry Muskrat." "Go to the head of the class, Peter," said Old Mother Nature, smiling. "Jerry is the very one, the largest member of the Rat family. Sometimes he is spoken of as a little cousin of Paddy the Beaver. Probably this is because he looks something like a small beaver, builds a house in the water as Paddy does, and lives in very much the same way. The truth is, he is no more closely related to Paddy than he is to the rest of you. He is a true Rat. He is called Muskrat because he carries with him a scent called musk. It is not an unpleasant scent like that of Jimmy Skunk, and isn't used for the same purpose. Jerry uses his to tell his friends where he has been. He leaves a little of it at the places he visits. Some folks call him Musquash, but Muskrat is better. Jerry is seldom found far from the water, and then only when he is seeking a new home. He is rather slow and awkward on land, but in the water he is quite at home, as all of you know who have visited the Smiling Pool. He can dive and swim under water a long distance, though not as far as Paddy the Beaver. "Has he webbed hind feet like Paddy?" piped up Jumper the Hare. "Yes and no," replied Old Mother Nature. "They are not fully webbed as Paddy's are, but there is a little webbing between some of the toes, enough to be of great help in swimming. His tail is of greater use in swimming than is Paddy's. It is bare and scaly, but instead of being flat top and bottom, it is flattened on the sides, and he uses it as a propeller, moving it rapidly from side to side. Like Paddy he has a dark brown outer coat, lighter underneath than on his back and sides, and like Paddy he has a very warm soft undercoat, through which the water cannot get and which keeps him comfortable, no matter how cold the water is. You have all seen his house in the Smiling Pool. He builds it in much the same way that Paddy builds his, but instead of sticks he cuts and uses rushes. Of course it is not nearly as large as Paddy's house, because Jerry is himself so much smaller. It is arranged much the same, with a comfortable bedroom and one or more passages down to deep water. In winter Jerry spends much of his time in this house, going out only for food. Then he lives chiefly on lily roots and roots of other water plants, digging them up and taking them back to his house to eat. When the ice is clear you can sometimes see him swimming below. "I know," spoke up Peter Rabbit. "Once I was crossing the Smiling Pool on the ice and saw him right under me." "Jerry doesn't build dams, but he sometimes digs little canals along the bottom where the water isn't deep enough to suit him," continued Old Mother Nature. "Sometimes in the winter Jerry and Mrs. Jerry share their home with 2 or 3 friends. If there is a good bank, Jerry usually has another home in that. He makes the entrance under water and then tunnels back and up for some distance, where he builds a snug little bedroom just below the surface of the ground where it is dry. Usually he has more than one tunnel leading to this, and sometimes an opening from above. This is covered with sticks and grass to hide it, and provides an entrance for fresh air. Jerry lives mostly on roots and plants, but is fond of mussels or fresh-water clams, fish, some insects, and, I am sorry to say, young birds when he can catch them. Jerry could explain where some of the babies of Mr. and Mrs. Quack the Ducks have disappeared to. Paddy the Beaver doesn't eat flesh at all. Jerry and Mrs. Jerry have several families in a year, and Jerry is a very good father, doing his share in caring for the babies. He and Mrs. Jerry are rather social and enjoy visiting neighbors of their own kind. Their voices are a sort of squeak, and you can often hear them talking among the rushes in the early evening. That is the hour they like best, though they are abroad during the day when undisturbed. Man is their greatest enemy. He hunts and traps them for their warm coats. but they have to watch out for Hooty the Owl at night and for Reddy Fox and Old Man Coyote whenever they are on land. Billy Mink also is an enemy at times, perhaps the most to be dreaded because he can follow Jerry anywhere. Jerry makes little landings of mud and rushes along the edge of the shore. On these he delights to sit to eat his meals. He likes apples and vegetables and sometimes will travel quite a distance to get them. Late in the summer he begins to prepare for winter by starting work on his house, if he is to have a new one. He is a good worker. There isn't a lazy bone in him. All things considered, Jerry is a credit to his family. But if Jerry is a credit to his family, there is one of its members who is not, and that is, who knows? "Robber the Brown Rat," replied Happy Jack Squirrel promptly. "I have often seen him around Farmer Brown's barn. Ugh! He is an ugly-looking fellow." "And he is just as ugly as he looks," replied Old Mother Nature. "There isn't a good thing I can say for him, not one. He doesn't belong in this country at all. He was brought here by man, and now he is found everywhere. He is sometimes called the Norway Rat, and sometimes the Wharf Rat and House Rat. He is hated by all animals and by man. He is big, being next in size to Jerry Muskrat, savage in temper, the most destructive of any animal I know, and dirty in his habits. He is an outcast, but he doesn't seem to care. He lives chiefly around the homes of men, and all his food is stolen. That is why he is named Robber. He eats anything he can find and isn't the least bit particular what it is or whether it be clean or unclean. He gnaws into grain bins and steals the grain. He gets into hen houses and sucks the eggs and kills young chickens. He would like nothing better than to find a nest of your babies, Peter Rabbit." Peter shivered. "I'm glad he sticks to the homes of men," said he. "But he doesn't," declared Old Mother Nature. "Often in summer he moves out into the fields, digging burrows there and doing great damage to crops and also killing and eating any of the furred and feathered folk he can catch. But he is not fond of the light of day. His deeds are deeds of darkness, and he prefers dark places. He has very large families, sometimes 10 or more babies at a time, and several families in a year. That is why his tribe has managed to overrun the Great World and why they cause such great damage. Worse than the harm they do with their teeth is the terrible harm they do to man by carrying dreadful diseases and spreading them, diseases which cause people to die in great numbers." "Isn't Robber afraid of any one?" asked Peter. "He certainly is," replied Old Mother Nature. "He is in deadly fear of one whom every one of you fears, Shadow the Weasel. One good thing I can say for Shadow is that he never misses a chance to kill a rat. Wherever a rat can go, he can go, and once he finds a colony he hunts them until he has killed all or driven them away. When food becomes scarce, Robber and his family move on to where it is more plentiful. Often they make long journeys, a great number of them together, and do not hesitate to swim a stream that may be in their path." "I've never seen Robber," said Peter. "What kind of a tail does he have?" "I might have known you would ask that," laughed Old Mother Nature. "It is long and slim and has no hair on it. His fur is very coarse and harsh and is brown and gray. He has a close relative called the Black Rat, but the latter is smaller and has been largely driven out of the country by his bigger cousin. Now I guess this is enough about Robber. He is bad, all bad, and hasn't a single friend in all the Great World." "What a dreadful thing, not to have a single friend," said Happy Jack. "It is dreadful, very dreadful," replied Old Mother Nature. "But it is wholly his own fault. It shows what happens when one becomes dishonest and bad at heart. The worst of it is Robber doesn't care. Tomorrow I'll tell you about some of his cousins who are not bad." End of Chapter 13.
Of the Burgess Animal Book for Children. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Burgess Animal Book for Children by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 14. A Trader and a Handsome Fellow. The Cotton Rat, Wood or Pack Rat, and the Kangaroo Rat. Way down in the sunny South, began Old Mother Nature, lives a member of the Rat family who, though not nearly so bad as Robber, is none too good, and so isn't thought well of at all. He is little Robber the Cotton Rat, and though small for a rat, being only a trifle larger than Striped Chipmunk, looks the little savage that he is. He has short legs and is rather thick-bodied, and appears much like an overgrown meadow mouse with a long tail. The latter is not bare like Robber's, but the hair on it is very short and thin. In color he is yellowish-brown and whitish underneath. His fur is longer and coarser than that of other native rats. He lives in old fields, along ditches and hedges, and in similar places where there is plenty of cover in which he can hide from his enemies. He burrows in the ground and usually has his nest of dry grass there, though often in summer it is the surface of the ground. He does not live in and around the homes of men, like the Brown Rat, but he causes a great deal of damage by stealing grain in the shock. He eats all kinds of grain, many seeds, and meat when he can get it. He is very destructive to eggs and young of ground-nesting birds. He has a bad temper and will fight savagely. Mr. and Mrs. Cotton Rat raise several large families in a year. Foxes, owls, and hawks are their chief enemies. But there are other members of the Rat family far more interesting and quite worth knowing. One of these is Trader the Wood Rat, in some parts of the Far West called the Pack Rat. Among the mountains he is called the Mountain Rat. Wherever found, his habits are much the same and make him one of the most interesting of all the little people who wear fur. Next to Jerry Muskrat, he is the largest native rat, that is, of the rats which belong in this country. He is about 2/3 as big as Robber the Brown Rat, but though he is of the same general shape, so that you would know at once that he is related to Robber, he is in all other ways wholly unlike that outcast. His fur is thick and soft, almost as soft as that of a squirrel. His fairly long tail is covered with hair. Indeed, some members of his branch of the family have tails almost as bushy as a squirrel's. His coat is soft gray and a yellowish brown above, and underneath pure white or light buff. His feet are white. He has rounded ears and big black eyes with none of the ugliness in them that you always see in the eyes of Robber. And he has long whiskers and plenty of them. "But why is he called Trader?" asked Rabbit a bit impatiently. "Patience, Peter, patience. I'm coming to that," chided Old Mother Nature. "He is Trader because his greatest delight is in trading. He is a born trader if ever there was one. He doesn't steal as other members of his family, but trades. He puts something back in place of whatever he takes. It may be little sticks or chips or pebbles or anything else that is handy, but it is something to replace what he has taken. You see, he is very honest. If Trader finds something belonging to someone else that he wants, he takes it, but he tries to pay for it. Next to trading, he delights in collecting. His home is a regular museum. He delights in anything bright and shiny. When he can get into the camps of men, he will take anything he can move. But being honest, he tries to leave something in return. All sorts of queer things are found in his home: buckles cut from saddles, spoons, knives, forks, even money he has taken from the pockets of sleeping campers. Whenever any small object is missed from a camp, the first place visited in search of it is the home of Trader. In the mountains he sometimes makes piles of little pebbles just for the fun of collecting them. He is found all over the West, from the mountains to the deserts, in thick forests and on sandy wastes. He is also found in parts of the East and in the sunny South. He is a great climber and is perfectly at home in trees or among rocks. He eats seeds, grain, many kinds of nuts, leaves, and other parts of plants. In the colder sections he lays up stores for winter. "What kind of home does he have?" asked Happy Jack. "His home usually is a very remarkable affair," replied Old Mother Nature. "It depends largely on where he is. When he is living in rocky country he makes it amongst the rocks. In some places he burrows in the ground. But more often it is on the surface of the ground, a huge pile of sticks and thorns, in the very middle of which is his snug, soft nest. The sticks and thorns are to protect it from enemies. When he lives down where cactus grow, those queer plants with long sharp spines, he uses these, and there are few enemies who will try to pull one of these houses apart to get at him. When he is alarmed or disturbed, he has a funny habit of drumming on the ground with his hind feet, in much the same way that Peter Rabbit and Jumper the Hare thump, only he does it rapidly. Sometimes he builds his house in a tree. When he finds a cabin in the woods, he at once takes possession, carrying in a great mass of sticks and trash. He is chiefly active at night, and a very busy fellow he is, trading and collecting. He has none of the mean disposition of Robber the Brown Rat. Mrs. Trader has 2 to 5 babies at a time and raises several families in a year. As I said before, Trader is one of the most interesting little people I know of, and he does very, very funny things. Now we come to the handsomest member of the family, Longfoot, the kangaroo rat, so called because of his long hind legs and tail and the way in which he sits up and jumps. Really, he is not a member of the rat branch of the family, but closely related to the pocket mice. You see, he has pockets in his cheeks. Like mine? Asked Striped Chipmunk quickly. No, they are on the outside instead of the inside of his cheeks. Yours are inside. I think mine must be a lot handier, asserted Striped Chipmunk, nodding his head in a very decided way. Longfoot seems to think his are quite satisfactory, replied Old Mother Nature. He really is handsome, but he isn't a bit vain and is very gentle. He never tries to bite when caught and taken in a man's hand. But you haven't told us how big he is or what he looks like, protested impatient Peter. When he sits up or jumps, he looks like a tiny kangaroo. But that doesn't mean anything to you, and you are no wiser than before, for you have never seen a kangaroo, replied Old Mother Nature. In the first place, he is about the size of Striped Chipmunk. That is, his body is about the size of Striped Chipmunk's, but his tail is longer than his head and body together. My, it must be some tail, exclaimed Peter Rabbit admiringly. Old Mother Nature smiled. It is, she said. You would like that tail, Peter. His front legs are short and the feet small, but his hind legs are long and the feet big. Of course you have seen Nimbleheels the Jumping Mouse, Peter. Peter nodded. Of course, he replied. My, how that fellow can jump! Well, Longfoot is built on the same plan as Nimbleheels, and for the same purpose, continued Old Mother Nature. He is a jumper. Then I know what that long tail is for, cried Peter. It is to keep him balanced when he is in the air, so that he can jump straight. Right again, Peter, laughed Old Mother Nature. That is just what it is for. Without it, he never would know where he was going to land when he jumped. As I told you, he is a handsome little fellow. His fur is very soft and silky. Above, it is a pretty yellowish brown, but underneath it is pure white. His cheeks are brown, he is white around the ears, and a white stripe crosses his hips and keeps right on along the sides of his tail. The upper and under parts of his tail are almost or quite black, and the tail ends in a tuft of long hair which is pure white. His feet are also white. His head is rather large for his size, and long. He has a long nose. Longfoot has a number of cousins, some of them much smaller than he, but they all look very much alike. Where do they live? Asked Johnny Chuck, for Johnny had been unable to stay away from school another day. In the dry, sandy parts of the Southwest, places so dry that it seldom rains, and water is to be found only long distances apart, replied Old Mother Nature. Then how does Longfoot get water to drink? Demanded Chatterer the Red Squirrel. He gets along without drinking, replied Old Mother Nature. Such moisture as he needs he gets from his food. He eats seeds, leaves of certain plants, and tender young plants just coming up. He burrows in the ground and throws up large mounds of earth. These have several entrances. One of these is the main entrance, and during the day this is often kept closed with earth. Under the mound he has little tunnels in all directions, a snug little bedroom and storerooms for food. He is very industrious and dearly loves to dig. Longfoot likes to visit his relatives sometimes, and where there are several families living near together, little paths lead from mound to mound. He comes out mostly at night, probably because he feels it to be safer then. Then, too, in that hot country it is cooler at night. The dusk of early evening is his favorite playtime. If Longfoot has a quarrel with one of his relatives, they fight, hopping about each other, watching for a chance to leap and kick with those long, strong hind feet. Longfoot sometimes drums with his hind feet, after the manner of Trader the Wood Rat. Now I think this will do for the morning. If any of you should meet Whitefoot the Wood Mouse, tell him to come to school tomorrow morning. And you might tell Danny Meadow if you little folks want school to continue. "We do!" cried Peter Rabbit and Jumper the Hare and Happy Jack Squirrel and Chatterer the Red Squirrel and Striped Chipmunk and Johnny Chuck as one. End of chapter 14.